Hello, everyone. My name is Olive, and sharing this story today took a lot of courage out of me. You see, I wasn't born a girl, but today I am one after I transitioned. But my story runs far from a typical happy transitioning story because I regret doing it. My story is a complicated one. I'm not even sure I understand it myself, but please bear with me. I was confused about my gender ever since I could remember. Confused and jealous. Jealous of who? My female twin sister. Her name is Ellie. I've always envied her for being a girl, and all the things she was able to do which I couldn't. At first it was little things. I wanted to play with her toys. I would only wear socks with frills at the ankles because I liked the way they looked. I preferred my hair longer so I could tuck it behind my ear and run my fingers through it. Despite my jealousy, I never let the body I was in stop me from expressing myself. I shied away from rough boys' games, and I hated being dirty. I went to birthday parties where my mom would dress me in a little suit and bow tie, but I would spend hours watching the girls in their pretty dresses, not understanding why I couldn't have a flouncy skirt and a little tiara too. When I started school, I was told I'd have to get my hair cut, that it wasn't an appropriate length for a boy. My mom took me to the hairdresser, and I screamed and cried so hard that I passed out, but they cut my hair anyway. When I was 7, my parents were called into school to speak to the teachers about me. They said that I refused to play with the other boys. I wouldn't speak to anyone for hours at a time. I insisted on being Ellie's sister, not a brother. That's the first time the word trans was mentioned. I was taken to see the doctor, and they asked me loads of questions. My parents, too. I knew that something important was happening. They sat us down and explained that it was no one's fault, but that I had been born in the wrong body, and that's what my behavior was expressing. I remember feeling excited, like I was finally being listened to. Someone understood. My parents struggled. It was very hard for them to accept this, but they tried their best to keep an open mind to it. I could notice that my dad's mouth would become a hard line when I walked into the room wearing a dress. My mom would well up when people asked her how her son was. Despite it all, they spoke to the school and explained that I was going to be living as a girl, that I would be living as Olivia. They let me grow my hair again, and I could go back to wearing frilly socks. All I could remember from that time was how happy I felt. Finally, I was going to get to be one of the girls. As soon as I became old enough, I started to take hormones. They stopped my voice dropping and facial hair growing. I grew breasts and my features stayed soft. Then, when I was 18, I finally had the surgery that made me biologically female. You'd think that my story would have a happy ending at this point, right? Well, that was what I thought too, until reality failed me. After the surgery, that everything went downhill. First, it was my parents. They struggled in accepting what I had done, even though they expected it. Our relationship, which had been strained before, became almost non-existent. The only person who fully accepted me was Ellie. A while after the transition, my sister took me out to a bar with her friends for the first time. I was excited. It was my first time showing myself off to the world as a girl. I was still insecure about it, but my sister tried to boost up my confidence. I put on full makeup and a nice outfit. However, my excitement didn't last long because I was constantly hunted by a feeling of discomfort. I'm not sure why, but I was there being my most feminine self. I thought I'd finally truly feel like a woman. But every time I looked in the mirror, I felt regret and disappointment because my expectations of this transitioning did not match my current reality. If anything, the feeling of existing in the wrong body hit me again. I was terrified. I just kept drinking to try and forget. By the time we got to the dance floor, I could barely stand. I danced with Ellie. I danced with strangers. I did shots at the bar. At some point during the night, I met a man. I'd never had attention paid to me before. I wanted to be able to giggle flirtatiously and flick my hair as they did on TV. I thought I'd finally feel at home in my new skin, but I felt uncomfortable and awkward. I was afraid he'll know. When he touched me on the arm, I panicked and ran away. Ellie ran after me and asked me what was wrong. I told her that I didn't like it when that stranger had touched me. She laughed and said, "Welcome to being a woman." I tried to laugh along with her. I was too scared to tell her what I really meant, that I didn't like him touching me because I still felt wrong in myself. When we were in the taxi home, I closed my eyes and pretended that I'd had too much to drink. Ellie and her friends were joking around and having a good time, whilst all I could think was, I've made a mistake. As the months went by, that feeling only got stronger. Rather than the elation and freedom that I'd felt when I was younger, I was uneasy all the time. My new shape still wasn't right. I didn't understand. This was everything I'd ever wanted. People kept asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't tell them. I was ashamed of myself. What was wrong with me? All the time and effort and heartbreak that both me and my family had been through, I felt ungrateful. I became more and more withdrawn. I stopped going out. I would just sit in my room in the dark. If I ever happened to catch sight of myself in a mirror, the curves of my body just filled me with disgust. I started having panic attacks where my chest would tighten and I couldn't breathe. If I wasn't happy as a man and I wasn't happy as a woman, how would I ever be happy? One day, my dad knocked on my door. We'd barely spoken for months. He came in and sat down at my desk. He cleared his throat. "So it seems you're unhappy," he said. I just did a small nod. My heart was beating so fast. He looked up sadly. "You weren't happy as my son, I know that. I've made my peace with it. But looks like you're not happy as my daughter either. And that hurts me. All a parent wants is for their kids to be happy. You're still so young, and you've got a lifetime of choices ahead of you. I don't want you to feel like you've made a mistake. You did the best you could do with what you felt at the time. Maybe you're a mix of Oliver and Olivia. Maybe you're both of those people. Maybe you've spent so long trying to be who you thought you were supposed to, you've left behind who you actually are. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. It seems to me that there are levels now. Everyone's got a bit of everything, and they're allowed to be that." He got up and patted me on the shoulder. "Something to think about." After he'd gone, I sat for a long time thinking. Then I slowly walked over to the mirror. As I looked over my body, I tried to breathe through the waves of panic. Was he right? Could it be true that I identified as both Oliver and Olivia? I realized that it's not about the way I look, but about how I feel inside. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. After that day, I spent hours looking into it, speaking to professionals, and once I was finally honest about my feelings, I got the help I needed. I finally have context for all those years of feeling like an outsider. I'm just Olive now, and I identify as gender fluid. Sometimes I have Oliver days, sometimes Olivia days. I found a way to be happy in my own skin after years of turmoil. My relationship with my parents is improving every day. I think all along I was just looking for acceptance. This was hard for me to share, but I'm glad I did. If you're struggling with your gender identity, please know that you're not alone. Things are not always black and white, and it's okay, if anything.
Hi, my name is May, and I come from a bit of a weird family. My mom, Karen, is a single mom. She's always had to work a couple of jobs to support me, so I spent a lot of time at my grandma's house when I was growing up. Grandma's house was a paradise for a kid. She lived in the suburbs of the town in this cool little cottage that looked like something out of a fairy tale. To get to her house, you had to drive down a dirt road that crisscrossed streams and took you over mythical-looking bridges. My grandma's always been a little eccentric, but as a kid, that was the best thing I could have asked for. We'd play in the woods all day long. She'd talk to the animals as if she was having a full-on conversation with them, and sometimes it kind of seemed like she was. We'd go into her house, and she'd lay crystals out in the window and dry herbs in the rafters. She'd even let me help her make different herbal remedies for sick people in the town. For most of my childhood, everything was perfect. But then, things started getting kind of weird. Once I hit middle school, I still loved doing those things with my grandmother, but the kids in my class had started to hear about the witch that was living in the woods. I always thought the stuff she did was cool, but it seemed like everyone else thought it was nerdy and creepy. To make matters worse, pretty much everyone knew that I was with her every day after school. I started having to laugh off their taunts when they would call my grandmother a hag or evil, but deep down, it really hurt. My grandmother had practically raised me. On top of that, I started to hear weird things in the woods. At least, I thought I did. It was probably some fox or other animals calling out at night, but the sounds made me anxious. My brain scrambled them into voices of monsters, and it made me feel like I was constantly being watched. When I texted Grandma about it one morning, she showed up to pick me from school like always, but she immediately hopped out of the car and started cleansing me with herbs in front of everyone. I was absolutely mortified. All my classmates watched in mocking shock and amazement while I stood there in the cloud as my grandma rushed around me in a frenzy, chanting like a crazy person. I knew the purpose of what she was doing. She likes to use tradition and natural herbs, but I could understand why it made her look like an alien to everyone else. My classmates started taping pentagrams and other creepy stuff on my locker. I'd watch them all giggle as I tore it down. And some people even started talking about the Salem witch trials, saying they thought it was time for a second round. Honestly, I started to get scared and embarrassed. What if my grandma really was a freak? Was she rubbing off on me? Was she actually a witch? I asked my grandma to start picking me up down the street, and at first, I felt really bad about it. But as time progressed, and the taunting didn't stop, I knew I made the right choice by distancing that part of my life from my school life. Once I hit high school, I barely spent time with my grandma anymore. I was old enough to be home by myself, so she didn't need to pick me up, and I didn't need to go over at all. Around that time is where I met Jason. Jason was one of the cool kids. He always had been. And even though kids still remember me as the witch girl, it's almost like enough time had passed that they all started to forget about it. Jason was my chance to live a normal life. I felt like as soon as I became his girlfriend, people would start to like me. I would finally be cool. So when Jason invited me out, I jumped on it. He invited me to ride past curfew in a fancy car with his older friends to go egg a house. And they told me they always do it for fun. Just that was 10 times cooler than anything I had ever done. But when we turned the corner down a familiar dirt road, my heart sank. Everyone started throwing eggs at my grandmother's house, and I felt the disgust and panic set in. Jason nudged me and handed me an egg. Everyone looked at me, waiting for me to react. If I said no, if I didn't do it, would that make me the weird kid all over again? I tossed the egg and watched it splatter against the house. I instantly felt ashamed, but all the cool kids cheered and Jason grabbed my hand. The more I hung out with Jason's group, the more creepy stuff started happening around town. Weird occult symbols started showing up on banners, houses, fences. It seemed like they were everywhere. On top of that, pets were going missing almost every day. Instantly, everyone was whispering about how the witch at the edge of town was the reason, and I didn't tell them it wasn't. Could it really be my grandma? Once the cops got involved, it seemed like every day I was hearing the blame get placed on my grandma. I tried to avoid talking about it as much as possible. I started ignoring her calls. I tried to divert any conversation my classmates had away from her. I was focusing so much on avoiding it that I never could have expected what would happen during the school play. Opening night, I stepped onto the stage in the lead role and was shocked to see my grandma in the audience. Seeing my grandma and my classmates in the same room instantly made my stomach sick. As the play went on, I couldn't help but notice my classmates and even their parents glancing in her direction. When I announced the intermission, everything fell apart. People started yelling at my grandma, asking why she was taking their pets, why she was leaving her weird symbols all